The traps had been reset, not sprung, not stolen, reset. Every trigger plate repositioned, every jaw snapped shut. The bait, gone, replaced with stones. 11 traps, 17 miles of Arctic ice, 9 touched. Not by weather, not by animals. Something that understood exactly what those traps were for. And it wanted the hunters to know. 3 professional trappers. Years of experience across the northern territories. Marcus Hale, 41, 16 years. Daniel Reyes, 38, 12. Raymond Kessler, 62, 4 decades on the ice. They knew every sound, every shift, every warning the frozen world could give. But none had ever seen this. The date, February 9th. Temperature minus 31 Celsius. Nearest settlement, 63 miles south. And something was already watching. Shadows shifting on the ice. Wind whispering through the traps. And it was patient. The trap line ran 17 miles across ice that had held solid for 3 consecutive weeks. That mattered. 3 weeks of stability on interior Arctic ice was not something you ignored. It was the signal the season had turned, that the conditions were right, that the window was open. Marcus, Daniel, and Raymond had been waiting for exactly this. They moved fast when it came, the way professionals always do, setting the full line in 2 days, anchoring each trap to pressure ridges, marking positions with cairns built from ice chunks and loose stone. 17 miles, 11 traps, spacing calculated to maximize coverage without wasting travel time. They returned on the 4th day. Light snowfall had come through the night before, just enough to soften the surface, not enough to bury anything. Visibility was good. The ice was still holding. What they found made no sense. Every trap they approached along the main route had been sprung. That alone wasn't alarming. Animals trigger traps without getting caught all the time. Bait disappears. Triggers misfire. You learn not to read too much into a sprung trap. But these had been handled after the fact. Deliberately. Someone, or something, had gone back to each one and reset it. Not correctly. The resets were imprecise, clumsy in some places. But the intent was clear. Jaw closed. Trigger plate repositioned. Bait removed entirely, or swapped out for stones that matched the weight of the original placement. 3 of the traps had been moved. Physically lifted from their anchored positions and replanted several feet away, upright in the snow, sticking out like markers. Like they were being displayed. Marcus stood over the first one for a long time without speaking. Then he crouched and looked at the metal. Scratches, tooth marks, blood, any kind of biological trace that could point to an animal large enough and dexterous enough to do something like this. Nothing. The snow around each trap showed disturbance, but it was shallow and diffuse. Wide, smooth impressions, like something had been dragged across the surface in broad strokes, deliberately obscuring tracks. Not the kind of mark left by paws, not the kind left by boots. Daniel knelt beside one trap that had been flipped upside down and pressed, face first into the ice. He touched the frame, cold but not frozen in place, recently handled. He looked up at the other 2 men. This wasn't an animal, he said. Raymond didn't respond. He was already moving to the next one. They checked the rest of the line methodically. 9 out of 11 traps had been tampered with. The 2 that were untouched were the farthest from camp, set on thin ice near open water, difficult to access, exposed. The ones that had been handled were the traps, placed on the route the hunters used most often, the path they walked every single day. Whatever had done this knew their route. They returned to camp and sat with that knowledge for a while. The conversation that followed was careful, low-voiced. Marcus floated the idea of another trapping party trying to scare them off the territory. It happened. Rival operations sometimes got territorial, especially during a good season. Daniel suggested a lost traveler. Someone disoriented and confused, scavenging for tools or shelter. Not understanding what they were disturbing, Raymond shook his head at both. People don't reset traps, he said. People steal traps. People break traps. They don't put them back. He let that sit. None of them could explain who would be out in minus 31, 60 miles from the nearest settlement, resetting trap triggers and replacing bait with stones. The math didn't work. There were no other licensed operations in the area, no survey crews, no government patrols this time of year, no one. They decided to reset the line and pay closer attention. This time they documented everything. Scratched the exact coordinates of each trap into the ice with a blade. noted the angle of every anchor, the depth of every stake. If something moved the traps again, they would have a precise baseline to measure against. They would know exactly how far, in what direction, and how much force had been used. They worked fast and returned to camp before dark. The fire that night was quiet. No one was joking. Cold rations, close proximity. One man kept watch without being asked. The next morning, before first light, they were back on the line. Every trap had been moved again, not randomly, not chaotically. Each one had been shifted in a specific direction, away from the campsite of the ridge, toward the open channel to the east. 9 traps, 9 deliberate relocations. Some had been moved only a few feet. Others had been carried almost 20 yards. But the pattern was consistent. Whatever was doing this wasn't confused, wasn't scavenging, wasn't curious. It was pushing them. And if that wasn't enough to shake 3 men who had spent their careers learning how to stay calm in hostile environments, what came next was, because the tampering wasn't the only thing that had changed overnight, the ice had too. So what exactly were they dealing with? And what did the ice tell them that the traps hadn't? These were not recreational hunters. That distinction mattered more than it might seem. Marcus Hale had started running trap lines at 25 on a 2-man crew in the Yukon interior. By 30, he was leading contracted operations for a mid-sized pelt company out of Whitehorse. By 41, he had logged more than 15 full seasons in environments most hunters would refuse to enter. He was not someone who panicked. He was not someone who misread terrain. Daniel Reyes came from a different route. Commercial fishing off the Alaskan coast before an injury took him off the water and onto the ice. 12 years running lines in some of the harshest archipelago conditions in North America. He understood cold the way other men understood their own homes, as something familiar, manageable, predictable within reason. Raymond Kessler was the outlier. 62 years old, 4 decades of Arctic fieldwork across 4 different countries. He had worked for logging surveys, mapping expeditions, wildlife research teams, and private contracting operations. He had been on the ice in conditions that killed other men and walked out. Not because he was stronger, because he paid attention to things others dismissed. He was the one the other 2 listened to when everything else stopped making sense. Their equipment reflected who they were. Nothing casual, nothing decorative. Steel traps with redundant anchoring systems, skinning knives in a sealed leather roll, fire kits with 2 ignition sources per man, sleds modified with reinforced runners for ice travel, weight distribution optimized for speed on flat surfaces and control on unstable ones, 3 days of emergency rations kept separate from the main food supply and never touched unless the situation demanded it, rope load tested before every season and replaced at the first sign of fraying, maps drawn from a combination of satellite reference and personal memory, cross-checked against landmarks that only appeared under specific light conditions, ridgelines that caught the low Arctic sun at a particular angle, channel edges that reflected differently depending on ice thickness, pressure formations that served as reliable trail markers when nothing else could. Survival in that environment was never about raw endurance. It was about systems, about recognizing the variables you could control, managing them precisely, and identifying early when something had moved outside the expected range. Trap lines were the foundation of the entire operation. A line was not just a sequence of equipment. It was a circuit, a daily rhythm, a commitment to a specific geography. Setting each trap required choosing ground that was stable enough to anchor properly, calculating trigger tension so it would fire on contact but not freeze, into a locked position overnight, and securing bait against wind and scavengers, without making it inaccessible to target animals. Each decision built on the last. A poorly placed trap caught nothing. A moved trap disrupted every trap around it, broke the spacing logic, altered the bait ratios, threw off the timing. They understood the environmental threats. Polar bears were a constant background consideration. If a bear smelled food, it would investigate. And a bear investigating your camp was a problem that escalated quickly. They stored food accordingly. Ice fracture was another variable. Temperature shifts that happened too fast for surface. Ice to equalize could open cracks without warning, turning a solid route into open water in minutes. Storms could erase trail, markers so completely that a man who stepped outside to check his equipment could lose his camp in the time it took to turn around. These were problems with logic to them. You could anticipate them, prepare for them, survive them through careful decision-making. Tampering was different. Tampering meant intent. It meant observation. It meant something had been watching the line long enough to learn the layout. the spacing, the routines, and had chosen to intervene in a way that was precise enough to avoid detection, but obvious enough to be noticed. That was not a weather problem. That was not a wildlife problem. That was something that understood cause and effect, and was using that understanding deliberately. The men voted to stay. They had 2 weeks remaining on the contracted period. The yield so far was modest, enough to cover operating costs, but not enough to turn a profit. Leaving early meant losing the season entirely. They agreed to tighten their protocols. Camp moved closer to the trap line, rotating watches through the night, weapons carried at all times, 2 trap checks per day instead of 1, and a set of decoy traps, positioned to look real but unlinked from the main line, designed to show interference without costing them actual equipment. For 3 days nothing happened. The traps stayed where they were set. No bait was touched. No metal was moved. The decoys remained undisturbed. The watches were uneventful. The nights were cold and quiet in the way the Arctic was supposed to be quiet. Deep. Total silence broken only by wind, and the occasional low groan of ice settling under its own weight. The men started to decompress. The conversation shifted from what was out there to where they'd spend their earnings. When the season ended, Daniel talked about going to his sister's place in Tucson for 2 weeks. Marcus mentioned a woman he'd been corresponding with in Calgary. Even Raymond allowed himself a dry joke about finally retiring, which he'd been saying for 10 years. They had almost convinced themselves it was over. On the 4th morning, they found the ice. The route to the western section of the trap line crossed a flat pan, thick, clear, slow-formed ice that had been stable since before they arrived. They had walked it a dozen times without hesitation. There was no reason to approach it any differently that morning. But overnight, pressure ridges had appeared along both edges of the pan, not massive formations, not the dramatic upheavals that came with tectonic ice movement. Small, precise ridges, sharp-edged, consistent in height, running parallel to each other from opposite sides of the flat surface, curving inward, narrowing the navigable center into a corridor maybe 8 feet wide. The temperature had been steady, no freeze-thaw cycle, no storm surge, no seismic activity that could explain spontaneous ridge formation. But there they were. Daniel walked the corridor slowly and studied the shape of it. The ridges didn't just narrow the path, they directed it. They funneled movement toward a specific point at the far end of the pan where the ice surface looked darker, less reflective. They tested the dark section carefully, probing with a pole before committing any weight. It was thinner, not dangerously thin if you moved slow and spread your weight. But if you were moving quickly pulling a loaded sled, trusting ice, you'd walked a dozen times before. You would feel the difference too late. Someone had shaped the surface to guide them, directly onto the weakest section of the pan. They marked the spot with stones and took the long route around. The diversion added 40 minutes to the day. That night the sound started, low rhythmic cracking, not the irregular settling sounds ice made on its own. Something measured, repeating, coming from multiple directions simultaneously, surrounding the camp at a distance. Marcus stepped outside first, stood still, listened. The sound was moving, slowly circling the perimeter. He took a torch and walked toward the nearest point of origin. The cracking stopped the moment he stepped past the firelight. He stood in the dark for a full minute. Nothing. He returned to camp. Before he reached the tent, it started again. If the sounds were a signal, what were they signaling? And why did everything that followed feel less like coincidence and more like a plan? The snowbank appeared overnight, 4 feet high, packed solid, sitting directly across the primary sled route they had used every single day for 2 weeks. It was not a drift. Drifts form gradually, taper at the edges, leave a slope on the windward side. This was a wall, uniform height, flat face, dense interior that resisted a shovel strike. Someone had built it, layer by layer, packed and compressed until it held its shape like concrete. Digging through it took over an hour. By the time they cleared the path and reached the trap line, half the working day was gone. 3 days later, the freshwater source was gone. A section of shore ice they had been using to access, meltwater near the channel edge, had been cut. Not broken, cut. The edges were vertical and smooth, perfectly clean lines that ran parallel to each other across a span of about 6 feet. The block had been removed entirely, leaving a gap too wide to step across and too deep to gauge without equipment they didn't have on them. Someone had used a blade, a precise one. They switched to melting snow. It worked, but it cost them time and fuel they hadn't budgeted for. That was when Marcus stopped pretending the changes were disconnected. He sat in the tent that night with a notebook and wrote down everything that had happened in sequence. Traps reset. Traps relocated. Ice ridges formed into a funnel toward thin ice. Sound circling camp. Snowbank across the primary route. Freshwater access eliminated. He looked at the list for a while. Then he showed it to the others. Nobody argued with what it implied. Each incident taken alone had an explanation that technically held. Animals could interfere with traps. Ice could shift overnight under certain pressure conditions. Snow could accumulate in unusual formations depending on wind patterns. Water access could change if underlying ice moved. But the sequence, the timing, the consistency of the direction, every single change made their routine harder. Longer routes, slower travel, more time exposed to cold, more fuel spent on tasks that had taken minutes before, and none of the changes destroyed anything outright. No equipment wrecked, no supplies taken, no direct physical threat, just friction. Sustained, escalating friction. The environment was being adjusted around them. Raymond recognized it. He had been watching it happen and choosing his words carefully, waiting until the others arrived at the same place he was already standing. He said the word quietly, the way you say something when you want to be heard but not amplified, Tornet. The other two went still. Everyone who worked the northern ice fields knew the word. Whether they believed in what it described or not, they knew it. It was passed down the way practical warnings always were, through the people who had actually been out there, in the margins of conversations about routes and equipment, in the things experienced trappers said once and didn't repeat. The Tornet were not folklore in the traditional sense. They weren't sea monsters or ghost stories told to frighten children. They were a functional category, a term used by northern field workers to describe encounters that didn't fit any known classification. Not wildlife, not human, not weather, something else. The descriptions were remarkably consistent across different companies, different decades, different regions. Tall figures seen at distance on open ice, broader than men, with proportions that didn't quite line up with anything familiar. Long arms, deliberate movement, never running, never hiding, just present watching. And always the interference. Tools moved, paths blocked, campsites surrounded but never entered. Terrain altered in ways that made habitation gradually more difficult without making it impossible. Raymond had heard the word used seriously twice in his career, once from a trapper named Sorensen, who had walked away from a profitable route in the Mackenzie Delta after his sleds kept getting tampered with. He never explained exactly what happened. He just said the environment had stopped cooperating, and there was no point staying somewhere that didn't want you. Once from a member of a mapping expedition, who described watching figures stand motionless on pressure ridges for hours, observing the camp never approaching. That expedition pulled out 4 days early. The lead surveyor filed a report that described the experience in purely logistical terms, environmental obstacles incompatible with continued operations. But the man who told Raymond the story said they all knew what they had actually seen. Neither group had been attacked. Neither group had been chased. They had simply been made to feel what Marcus and Daniel and Raymond were starting to feel, that this territory was occupied, and they were here by tolerance, and that tolerance was running out. Raymond described what the old accounts said about them physically: 8 feet, possibly more, upright, bipedal, but the proportions were wrong, too broad, too long in the arms, head too large for the frame, draped in something dark at distance, fur or hide or something that absorbed light. The face was never clearly described, too far away or shadow, or something about the features themselves that resisted focus. What distinguished them most was not their size. It was their intelligence. They used tools, not primitive implements, not rocks and sticks, but actual tools requiring knowledge of materials and mechanics. Ice saws, anchor systems, load-bearing structures built with enough precision to hold weight through temperature cycling. They understood terrain well enough to modify it. They tracked human routines and identified the exact points where disruption would cost the most without triggering immediate retreat. They were patient. Whatever they were doing with Marcus and his team was not impulsive. It had been building since the first tampered trap. Each step calculated, each escalation measured against the response it produced. Marcus asked the question that had been sitting in the room. Since Raymond said the word, "Are they dangerous?" Raymond paused for long enough that the pause itself was an answer. "That depends on what you mean," he said. "They don't hunt people. No account I've ever heard describes a direct attack, but dangerous doesn't only mean violence. If your route is blocked and your fuel runs out before you find another way through, the cold finishes the job. If your tools go missing and you can't hunt or maintain fire, you don't need a predator. The environment does the work for them. He looked at the notebook Marcus had left open on the crate between them. The question isn't whether they're dangerous. The question is whether we're being tested or expelled. He explained the distinction. Testing looked like what they had experienced so far. Interference, disruption, escalating difficulty. It was uncomfortable, disorienting, exhausting, but it left options open. You could still move. You could still work even if everything took longer. You still had your supplies and your equipment. The message, if you could call it that, was this is difficult? Do you understand yet? Expulsion was different. Expulsion meant escalation past the point of function. Traps destroyed rather than reset. Routes made impassable rather than difficult. Equipment not moved but gone. Campsites not circled but entered. Expulsion meant you were no longer being given the option to leave on your own terms. Raymond said he thought they were still in the first category, but he also said that could change. And if the line between being tested and being expelled was as thin as the ice they were standing on, how much time did they have before it broke? They saw one the next day. Full afternoon light, no wind. Visibility was sharp and clean. The kind of clarity the Arctic produced when temperature and atmosphere aligned, every ridge edge crisp, every shadow precise. The kind of conditions where you could see a man standing still at 200 yards without any ambiguity. They were working the eastern section of the trap line, the stretch that ran along a series of pressure ridges overlooking a frozen channel. The ridges here were older than the ones on the pan, built up over several seasons of freeze, cycles into formations that ran 10 to 15 feet high in places, with deep shadow on the northern face. The cut ice was what stopped them first. Not the figure, the ice. It was in the same style as what they'd found at the freshwater source. Clean, vertical edges, parallel cuts running across a section of ice sheet near the ridge base. But this time the scale was different. The removed section was roughly 10 feet by 6. The block hadn't been shattered or pushed aside carelessly. It had been extracted and placed upright next to the gap, leaning at a careful angle, intact, as if it was being stored, as if whoever had removed it might want it back later. Marcus crouched and ran his hand along the cut edge. It was slick, almost polished. No tool marks visible, no chipping at the corners where you'd expect stress fractures if something hard had been driven against it. The surface looked like it had been divided in a single, continuous motion rather than worked incrementally. His glove stuck briefly to the surface when he tried to pull his hand back. He peeled it free, stood and turned to say something to Daniel. Daniel wasn't looking at the ice. He was looking at the ridge. Marcus followed his gaze. The figure was standing approximately 60 yards out, positioned on the highest point of the nearest ridge, fully exposed against the open sky. It was facing them, not moving, not gesturing, just standing there watching. The first thing Marcus registered was the height, then the width. The shoulders were dramatically broad. Wider than the body beneath them seemed to support, with a mass to the chest that suggested a density far beyond anything human. The arms hung at its sides, long enough that the hands cleared what should have been the midpoint of the thigh by a significant distance. The head was large, rounded, with no clearly distinguishable features at 60 yards, dark all over. Not the reflective dark of wet material, but the flat, absorptive dark of something that didn't give light back. It did not move. For a full minute, none of the three men moved either. Daniel's hand went slowly toward his rifle. Raymond put a hand on his shoulder before it got there. He shook his head. If it was going to approach, it would have approached, he said quietly. If it wanted to leave, it would already be gone. He was right. The figure had been there when they arrived. It had watched them examine the ice. It had given them time to look, to react, to reach for weapons. And it still hadn't moved. Whatever it was communicating by standing there, aggression wasn't it. They watched it. It watched them. The air felt different. Marcus noticed it and then checked himself for letting suggestion influence perception. But it was real. Something subtly off about the quality of the atmosphere around that ridge. Heavier, flatter. the way air felt inside a structure rather than open on the surface. Then the figure turned. Not fast, not slow. A smooth, deliberate rotation that took several seconds to complete. Unhurried, completely controlled. When it was facing away from them, it began to walk along the ridgeline. The stride was extraordinary. Each step covered the ground that two long, human strides would cover. But there was nothing rushed in the movement. The pace was measured, economical. The same quality of motion they had seen in the way. The terrain had been altered. Nothing wasted. Everything purposeful. It reached the far end of the ridge and went down the other side. They stood for several more minutes, watching the point where it had disappeared. Nothing reappeared. The youngest in the group, Daniel, now the unofficial voice of practical response, asked if they should mark the location. Raymond said no. The Tornet already know where we are. Marking the spot doesn't tell us anything they don't already know. What mattered was deciding what to do with what they'd just seen. They returned to camp. Nobody rushed. Nobody ran. Running felt wrong, like the wrong answer to a test they were still being graded on. That evening, Raymond laid out the situation with the same flat precision he used for everything. Fuel, enough for 10 days. Food, 12 days at full ration, closer to 14 if they cut back. Yield, modest. Below what the season should have produced. Partly because of the interference, partly because the animals themselves seemed to have thinned out in the area over the past week. Financially, the operation was marginal. Staying longer meant more exposure for diminishing returns. Leaving meant admitting they had been pushed out. That was the part none of them wanted to say plainly. They were professionals. They had worked conditions that broke less experienced teams. They had dealt with bears, fracturing ice, equipment failures, whiteout storms that lasted 4 days. They had always walked out on their own terms. Walking out now, with 2 weeks still on the contract, felt like something else. They agreed to 3 more days. If the interference escalated beyond the current level, they would leave. If it held steady, they would finish the season and call it a difficult run. It was a compromise that satisfied nobody but gave them a structure to operate inside. The interference escalated. The first sign came on the second night. A skinning knife, one of 3 kept in a sealed leather roll inside the tent, was gone when they woke. The roll was still buckled. The other 2 knives were in place. The missing slot was empty. They searched everywhere. The tent interior, the sleds, the supply crates, the perimeter of the camp. The knife was not there. The next morning, it was planted upright in the ice 20 feet from the tent entrance. Blade buried halfway, perfectly vertical, handle unmarked. It had not been thrown. There was no impact mark around the entry point. It had been placed deliberately, carefully, with full control over the result. That afternoon, the firewood was moved again. But not relocated this time. Disassembled. 30 pieces of split wood, each one separated from the pile and laid individually on the ice in a straight line extending from the camp toward the pressure. Ridges, evenly spaced, exactly spaced. The line stretched for over 60 feet. It was not vandalism. It was communication. They gathered the wood and stacked it close to the tent, without discussing what the arrangement had meant. They all knew. Their resources were being counted. Their patterns were being studied, and now they were being shown, without any ambiguity, that the thing doing the studying could reach them anywhere, including inside. So what happened on the final night? And what did they find carved into the ice around the tent when they opened the door the next morning? The trap line was finished. Every trap they checked that morning had been disabled, not reset, not relocated but broken. Trigger plates bent at angles that required sustained force. Chains snapped clean. In 2 cases, the traps had been removed from their positions and stacked on top of each other in a neat pile, like freight waiting to be loaded. No damage to the surrounding ice. No sign of struggle or haste. The work had been done carefully and deliberately and completely. Marcus looked at the stacked traps for a long time. Then he said, "We're done with the line." Nobody argued. They returned to camp and began a quiet accounting of where things stood. The yield they had already taken was sealed and ready. The sleds were functional. If they broke camp now and moved at a steady pace, they could make the southern route in 2 days and reach the extraction point with a day to spare. It was the rational calculation. That night, none of them slept well. The sound started around midnight, not the circling cracking they had heard before. This was different. A dragging sound, slow and rhythmic, moving around the outside of the tent, maintaining a consistent distance from the walls. Not footsteps, something smooth being pulled across ice in a controlled pattern. Marcus had his rifle in his hands before he was fully awake. Raymond was already sitting upright. He held one hand flat, palm down, the signal they'd established for stay still. They lay there and listened. The sound continued for nearly an hour. Steady, patient, never stopping, never varying in pace, completing circuit after circuit around the perimeter of the tent. None of them spoke. None of them went outside. When the sound finally stopped, the silence that replaced it felt different than ordinary Arctic silence, weighted, present. In the morning they found the trench, a perfect circle cut into the ice around the tent. 6 inches deep, clean-sided uniform width, enclosed the entire camp within a boundary that had not existed the night before. Not chipped out, not scratched, cut with the same smooth precision that characterized every other modification they had found since the first morning on the trap line. Marcus stood at the edge of it and didn't say anything for a while. Then he stepped over it and walked to the sled to begin loading. The maps were wrong. They discovered it when Daniel unrolled the route charts to plan the southern return. The lines they had marked, routes, they had drawn themselves from direct observation and cross-referenced against landmarks which had been altered, new lines added, drawn with a precision that matched their own markings, so closely that the additions looked like their own work at first glance. The new lines led away from the stable routes they had established and toward areas they had specifically flagged as marginal: thinner ice, exposed crossings, sections with active pressure activity. Their own shortcuts had been erased, markers removed from the chart, obstacles that hadn't existed 2 weeks ago had been penciled in at points they would need to cross. Someone had studied their maps well enough to edit them convincingly. Daniel caught the changes before they moved out, barely. The new lines were subtle, integrated into the existing chart with enough care that a tired man moving quickly might not notice until he was already on the wrong ice. They set the maps aside and navigated by the landmarks Raymond carried in memory. But the landmarks were changing too. The cairns they had built as trail markers, stone and ice stacked carefully at regular intervals along the primary route, were being disassembled, not destroyed, disassembled stone by stone. The materials scattered, just far enough from the original position that the marker no longer functioned. When they reached the first one and found nothing but loose stones on flat ice, Marcus turned to Raymond. "How many of these do you still know by sight?" Raymond scanned the horizon for a long time. "Enough," he said. He wasn't entirely certain, and they both knew it. They moved south anyway. Steady pace, weapons visible, eyes on the ridgeline at all times. Raymond navigated from memory and instinct, reading the ice surface for the subtle changes in coloration and texture that indicated thickness and stability. He had done it for 40 years. He could do it now. On the first night of travel, camped in a shallow depression that offered some protection from wind, they heard something new. Not cracking, not dragging, a sound that none of them had a clean word for. Low, resonant, coming from a single point to the north rather than circling. It held a sustained pitch that vibrated at a frequency Marcus felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. It lasted approximately 4 minutes. Then it stopped and did not resume. Raymond said he had heard something like it once before, 20 years ago, on a mapping expedition in the northern Baffin region. He had never told the story because he didn't know how to tell it, without sounding like someone who had lost their grip on things. He described it as a sound that felt like an acknowledgement, not threatening, not welcoming, just a closing statement, like something had finished a sentence it had been writing for 2 weeks. The second day of travel passed without incident. The ice held. The routes Raymond chose proved stable. Nothing moved on the ridgelines. No sounds came in the night. The weather stayed clear, unusually clear, almost cooperative, as if the environmental pressure they had been moving through had lifted without announcement. By noon of the third day, they reached the extraction coordinates. The transport arrived on schedule. They loaded the sleds in silence. The driver, a man they had worked with before named Arlo, noticed their quiet and didn't push it. He had transported enough field crews to recognize when people had been through, something they weren't ready to explain. On the drive south, Daniel asked Raymond whether they should report what had happened. Raymond thought about it. Who would we report it to? He said. And what would we say? That something moved our traps? That the ice changed shape? That we heard sounds? He shook his head. The people who need to know already know. The people who don't believe it never will. Marcus filed a standard end-of-season report. Equipment losses noted, listed as environmental damage. Yield documented. Season terminated 3 days early. Reason given, unfavorable conditions. He did not write about the trench around the tent. He did not write about the maps. He did not write about the figure on the ridge, or the sound that felt like a closing statement. He did write one line that wasn't strictly standard. At the bottom of the route assessment section, under recommendations for future operations in the contracted zone, he wrote 4 words, "Do not return here." He submitted it, shut the laptop, and sat in the truck watching the ice fields shrink behind them, through the rear window until there was nothing left to see. And in that silence and those 4 words, lies the only question that still doesn't have a clean answer. What exactly did Marcus Daniel and Raymond encounter out there on the ice? And why did the thing that found them choose to let them leave?